Civil Inspector and a State of California Emergency Services Inspector. He is currently co-authoring a book for ICC on penetration fire stopping, joint systems, and dampers based on the new 2024 I-codes. As we did in the other sessions, if you have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A, and I will turn this over to Bill.
Thank you, Stacy. I appreciate it. Thank you for that kind introduction. We are going to be talking about the significant changes to the IBC today. I do want to let you know that there were a lot of changes that took place in the 24 code, some of which are a little less relevant to the audience today. There are things dealing with administrative, which is really more for the building code officials. But I tried to find the non-material specific, non-structural items and include those. And then also I'd like to try and explain to you how to use some of these changes as our time allows today. We've got a relatively short period of time to be able to go through all the changes, so some of them we're not going to spend much time on. However, if you have questions, I encourage that you ask those questions as we go through the Q&A. Stacy will read those to me and we'll get them answered for you. One of the big things that's happened with the 24 code is the format of the code book significantly different from what you've seen for many generations. Previously, the code book was always 2 columns per page, and now it's gone to looking more like most books where it's going to be 1 column per page. Now, for people like me that I don't have a photographic memory, but I have the kind of memory that I know that that code section I'm looking for is on the top left-hand column or the bottom of the right-hand column, or somewhere in between. For me, this is going to be an interesting learning experience because I won't be able to fall back on what I used to know. But I think for newer code users, this is going to be easier. Also, in all of the paper codes, you now have a QR code up in the page that'll take you directly to that code section on the digital code. Now, if you do happen to access the ICC digital codes, included now with your digital subscription is a link for all the code changes, follows each of the various code sections that'll explain to you what the code hearing dialogue was. You can actually watch the hearing on some of them. You can listen to the back and forth discussion, or you can read it. You can look at the reason statement that was submitted by the proponent. And this is all very valuable information that's in the 2024 code now. And what it'll do is help you understand the intent of the code change. Because if we don't understand the code change intent, we don't know how to apply it. So one of the administrative things that occurred in the codes now that will affect you as designers is that under section 104.10, 104.11, under the 24 code, or excuse me, 21 code, it now became the 104.2.3, which is alternate materials, designs, and methods. Same information we had in the code before, but now the code is recognizing that using the performance-based code is something that should be allowed as an alternate method. Now, anytime you go into 104.2.3 or the performance code, there's a set of criteria that it's going to tell you need to provide. And if you don't provide that information to the building official as part of your request for an alternate material or method, they have no way of being able to approve your request. So the code does say we're required a request to use alternative material, design, or method shall be submitted in writing to the building official. It's got to be done in a written format. Some building officials will accept it in an email. The intent of the code is that it's a letter sent to the building official, not just an email. And that way that alternative, when it's approved, becomes part of the plan. says where the alternative material design or method is not approved, the building official shall respond in writing stating the reason the alternative was not approved. And the whole reason for that is simply that you have the right to go to the Board of Appeals if you disagree. But unless the building official has told you specifically what the code reason is, what the reasons for disapproval is, you don't know what to take to the Board of Appeal. So that's the reason that it is in the code now that your response from the building official shall be in writing. Any alternative material, design, or method has to comply with the intent of the code. Now, the building you see in the picture here is one of many down in an area outside of Taos, New Mexico, and these are known as earthships. They're basically a home constructed of tires, bottles, plaster, mud, and stucco. So all of that, tires and bottles, you're never going to find in the code, so it's an alternative material. The entire neighborhood of homes, the subdivision is all built like this. The interesting thing about it is that to do an alternative material properly, that request is good for an individual site, an individual project, not good for an entire subdivision. However, my understanding is that in this case, because all the homes were being built similarly, they did an overreaching or an overall approval down in Taos for all of the various buildings to fall under this one alternative material appeal. Now, in 104.2.3.4, it gives you a list of items that you need to prove. So 3.3 and 3.4 give you a list of items. And it's important that you as designers, if you're making a request for an alternative material design or method, that you look at the code section and the specific items it tells you you need to prove equivalency in and make sure that your request covers those items. If you don't do that, the building official simply has no way that they can approve your request because you haven't proved equivalency or met the minimum criteria. So for instance, for alternative materials, it tells you have to, at the with respect to the following, you have to show equivalency in quality, strength, effectiveness, durability, safety other than fire safety, because that's covered under fire safety. So it's something that you need to make sure that your letter requesting the alternative material design or method covers this very clearly, and that for fire safety, if there's testing involved, or for strength, if there's testing involved, you need to show the equivalency therein. Now, fire tests are part of that equivalency, and it says any test conducted to demonstrate equivalent fire safety in support of an alternative material design or method shall be of a scale that is sufficient to predict fire safety performance of the end use configuration. Test has to be performed by a party acceptable to the building official. And I added a note that typically the building official wants test standard is being used to show equivalency. There's products on the market today that say they're tested, for instance, to ASTM E119 modified. Well, the minute they put that word modified on there, it's no longer tested to that standard. So you have to be able to show how the modified test gets you to the same end result. So it's not as simple as saying, I want to use a hempcrete brick because it, is easier to work with and it's going to stand up to wind and structural loads. But if there's fire resistancy involved, you're going to have to show the test standard as well. Now, if you're going to do this, you also need to be aware that supporting data might include test reports. And again, these have to be approved by the building official. I caution you as designers, make sure that the test standard the testing agency, the individual doing the test, is all approved by the building official before you take the time and spend the money to do the actual test. Because just because somebody holds a PE license does not make them qualified to do all these various tests. Um, I'm an extremely good welder, not bragging, but I build race cars, I build motorcycle frames, I build street cars. I can weld with the best of them. I will not ever do a welding inspection. I'm not qualified. So the fact that I, hold certification as a welder does not make me certified or qualified to be able to do welding inspections. Well, the same thing here is the fact that somebody is a structural PE doesn't necessarily make them qualified to provide the reports and do the testing, say for fire resistancy or energy. So you want to make sure that the individual that you're proposing in the firm is approved by the building official prior to starting that process. Now, we've had some changes that have occurred in Chapter 2 of the Building Code, definitions, and some of these are because of problems we've had with application of the code. One of the things that I always caution people when I'm teaching the classes on the codes is that always fall back to the definitions if you're not quite sure what something means. Remember that any phrase or any word in the code that's italicized is a defined term. And in older versions of the code, the definitions used to be in the beginning chapter, and then eventually all definitions have been moved into chapter 2. So you always want to make sure that, for instance, if you're looking at floor area gross or floor area net, those are defined terms. Go back to chapter 2 and look at the definitions so that we're all using the same terminology. One of the definitions that changed was high-rise buildings. So in the 24, it now says a building with an occupied floor or occupied roof located more than 75 feet above the lowest level of fire department vehicle access. So before we used to just measure the highest occupied floor, but the code over the last series of additions, the last three editions, has recognized that an occupied roof functions like any other story of the building. Now, it does not contribute to the allowable area or the floor area of a building. It does not contribute to the height and stories, but it is used as a measuring point for determining if you have a high-rise building. So that's a new change that took place in 24. The other thing that we changed in the 24 code is a definition of limited verbal or physical assistance. Now, this came into I1, I2 occupancies where we have condition 1 and condition 2 in chapter 3 of the code, and it referenced limited verbal or physical assistance. Nobody really knew what to do with that. So the definition was placed into the code, and it reads, it describes persons who, because of age, physical limitations, cognitive limitations, treatment, or chemical dependency, may not independently recognize, respond, or evacuate without limited verbal or physical assistance during an emergency. Limited verbal assistance includes prompting, giving and repeating instructions. Limited physical assistance includes assistance with transfer to walking aids or mobility devices or assistance with egress. So if you're in a hospital, for instance, or if you're in a nursing home and you physically can get yourself out, but you need limited verbal assistance, that falls under this definition. On the other hand, if you need someone to help you get out of bed and get to the walker or get to a wheelchair or even moved out in a gurney, that includes physical assistance. One thing you want to be aware of if you're dealing with I1 or I2 occupancies and also some of the R occupancies, there are, in most cases, it's condition 1 and 2. I3, we have condition all the way up to 5, I believe it is now. But each of the conditions in the various occupancy groups are not necessarily the same. So if you understand I1 condition 1 and 2, don't assume that it's the same in I2. Make sure that you go to chapter 3 and you look it up and confirm, is your situation condition 1 or condition 2 under that particular occupancy group. We made a really strange change in the 24 code definitions. For several generations of the code, we've called these areas you see in the photo occupied roofs. And for whatever reason, they felt it was necessary to change the language to occupiable roof. As the occupiable roof is defined as an exterior space on a roof designed for human occupancy other than maintenance or repair, and is equipped with a means of egress system meeting the requirements of the code. Now, when you go into chapter 10, for instance, occupied roofs have always been intended to be treated as a story for purposes of exiting, but for no other reason. So when we change the terminology to occupiable roof, it doesn't really change that. It's still that the occupiable roof is treated as a story for purposes of exiting only. When you look in chapter 10, there's now several references to occupiable roofs within that chapter of the code. Another one of the big things that you'll notice has changed in the 24 code is there are all sorts of references to lithium ion or lithium metal batteries. These are, as you all know, used in electric vehicles. They're used in other kinds of generators, etc. And what's happening, pardon me, what's happening is the problems we're having with fires are demanding that we take a harder and harder look at all the lithium ion or lithium metal batteries, not only the production, but the storage of them. Now, if you look at the slide, you'll see that this is considered Group B if it's for battery testing, research, and development. If it's for manufacturing or storage, it's going to be F1 or S1. The other thing we changed in the 21 code, I made a minor change in the 24, is that distilleries are no longer considered Group H as long as you sprinkle it. And so if you sprinkle the entire space, then a distillery can be considered classified as a Group F1. When we look at this change in 306.2 for the 24 code, it now says over 20% alcohol content, where it used to say beverages over 16%. Really, the biggest reason they made that minor change to 20% was that when you look at the distilling process, one of the biggest ingredients is water. And so the fact that the alcohol is 16% or 20% didn't really seem to have a big effect on how it would react as far as in a fire situation. So that all they determined that 20% was a viable number. So that change for beverages over 20% is now the trigger for when you classify it as Group F1 as opposed to F2. Beverages up to and including 20% alcohol are now considered as low hazard, factory industrial Group F2. Now there is some new exemptions in 307, which is our H occupancies chapter, and it talks about storage, use, and handling of hazardous materials in accordance with the MAQ table 307 shall not be counted as contributing to maximum allowable quantities and shall not cause classification of an occupancy to be considered as group H. They do still have to comply with the provisions of the fire code, but you can have hazardous materials without being a group H. And really, until you exceed the quantities shown in table 307.1, you're not a group H. And there are design tools that you can use to still avoid becoming a group H, but that hasn't changed in the current edition of the code. Now, the next slide is going to be a little bit hard to read. It didn't transfer from the website very well, but just be aware that table 307.1.1 is the table for hazardous material exemptions. And what it lists is some of the materials, the occupancy of the classification, and then the large column on the right is the exemptions. So when you look at that table, that's the information in the table that's referenced in this slide as far as this not contributing towards a building becoming a group H. Residential group R1 and R2, we made a couple of minor changes in the definitions. When we look in chapter 3 at section 310, residential group R1, it contains sleeping units or more than 2 dwelling units where the occupants are primarily transient in nature. So the language in blue is what was added. And what they did is they added that so that it really takes into consideration some of the more common smaller group R1 occupancies. You get into some of the not live work because that's a whole nother category, but some of the small R1 occupancies that may only have 3 or 4, maybe even 5 dwelling units in them. And they wanted to make sure that the language in the IBC separated them from a IRC building. Now, in residential group R2 now includes congregate living facilities non-transient with more than 16 occupants. Emergency services living quarters are classified as group R2. This is really going to be your fire stations, the sleeping units there for the firefighters, for instance. Or if you happen to be responding to a FEMA incident, that type of thing, and you're out with a FEMA group, if you fit under these criteria, that building that you're staying in will be classified as a group R2. Previously, it was thought of as being transient, and so they classified it as group R1. But when you look at the typical firehouse and a firefighter schedule, it's 2 days on, 4 days off, and then back to 2 days on. So while they don't live there full time and they are transient, that they have stays of less than 30 days, their familiarity with the surroundings is more like that you would have with an apartment building that you live in. And really, that's the trigger, and the difference between an R1 and R2 is familiarity with your surroundings. That's why the exit travel distances are different. That's why exit signs are different, etc., for transient versus non-transient. In group R3, if you have congregate living facilities with 16 or fewer occupants, then you're going to take a look at those, and you could be calling the R2 now an R3, whereas before it was with more than 16 occupants. Your moderate hazard storage has added some additional language now dealing with aerosol products, level 2 and 3 aerosol cooking sprays. But again, the beverages over 20% alcohol content, that's going to be, if it's stored, is going to be classified as group S1. As of the 21 code, it was no longer group H. And again, your lithium ion or lithium metal batteries and vehicle repair garages for vehicle powered lithium ion or lithium metal batteries. The repair garages was added because in a typical large scale, like a Tesla dealership, for instance, or even a Chevrolet or Ford dealership that has electric vehicles, if you have a number of vehicles in there, you're going to have quite a bit of the lithium ion batteries. But notice the language is vehicle garages for vehicles powered by lithium ion or lithium battery. So the intent when we go back and look at that section of the code didn't really make it clear. And I know there's a attempt with the 27 code. I don't know if it got passed or not, but we're currently doing the hearings for the 27 codes right now, actually. And one of the things they were trying to clarify was that if any vehicle that's powered by lithium ion is in the repair garage, it's an S1, or if all vehicles. So right now, the intent of this seems to be any vehicle, but I'm not sure that it's going to stay that way. We'll let you know, as we find out, you should be able to see what's happening in the 27 code. And maybe we'll be able to cover that another time once we know what they actually did. Your low hazard storage group S2 now includes beverages up to and including 20% alcohol by volume. So again, if you're storing them, then it could up to 20%, then it's going to be classified as S2. Now, there are still provisions in the fire code that have to be met. For instance, the photo you see here, even though the alcohol is less than 20% ABV, are we looking at high pile storage? Potentially so. And so the fire department in chapter 40 in the fire code went through a significant number of code changes to address the situation we see here and for storage of group S1 and S2 beverages. We were talking a little bit about occupiable roof areas before. One of the criteria in the code for occupiable roofs was that any kind of an enclosure around an occupiable roof shall not extend more than 48 inches above the surface. The reason for that was we were saying that the occupiable roof didn't contribute as a story because it doesn't act as a story except for purposes of exiting. If you start getting walls or enclosures higher than 48 inches around it, then it's going to retain smoke. And if it's a solid wall, it's also going to make it harder to see the fire. And so they wanted these walls to be relatively short. We had to be at least 42 to provide the guard. But they said we don't want them more than 48 inches. Well, in the 24 code, they added an exception to this. And as elements or structures enclosing the occupiable roof areas where the roof deck is located more than 75 feet above the lowest level of fire department vehicle access. So think back to one of our earlier slides. We were talking about the new definition of a high-rise building includes a measurement of 75 feet from the lowest level of fire department access to the floor of the occupied roof. So what they're looking at here is that saying, well, if it qualifies as a high rise, we're not going to be able to fight it from the outside of the building with normal ladders and equipment. We're going to fight the fire as we would a high rise. And so that being recognized, they said that for purposes of enclosures around the occupiable roof, they're going to go ahead and allow higher than 48-inch enclosures if that roof area is located more than 75 feet, therefore it's a high-rise building. So that's really the only reason the fire department actually put this code change in.
So Bill, we have a
Yes.
question back on the lithium batteries. So it says, does the 2024 code make any distinctions between, quote, state of charge of a lithium ion battery, or are all storage and manufacturing requirements the same regardless of charge?
So storage and manufacturing is either going to be F1 or S1. And at this time, there is no language in the code about the state of charge, whether it be, fully charged or 20% or none of that is addressed at this time.
Okay, that's the only question right now.
Okay. Thank you. In the 21 code, we made a significant change to the code and how you go about doing yard increases. And there was two new tables inserted into the code. And the tables, the first one was for general buildings for doing a yard increase. And the second table is one you see on the screen here. And this is for section 507 buildings. Now, a section 507 building is an unlimited area building. And the question always comes up, well, why do I need a yard increase for an unlimited area building? Well, there are some conditions where a building may not meet all of the criteria in section 507 to be an unlimited area building, but it meets the type of construction, the allowable occupancy groups, the number of stories, but perhaps it doesn't have the 60-foot yards all the way around. So a new table was put into the code to address that. Now, the reality is when you go back and look at the codes all the way back to 1994, there were provisions in the code that allowed you to do a yard increase for an unlimited area building. It was just a little complex or kind of buried as to how you did it. So now what they did in the 24 code was they added the language you see here in blue just to make it easier to understand. And it says where a building meets the requirements of 507 as applicable, except for compliance with the 60-foot public way or yard, the area factor increase based on frontage shall be determined in accordance with table 506.331. Then the new language, the frontage increase shall be based on the smallest public way or open space that is 30 feet or greater and the percentage of the building perimeter having a minimum of 30 feet public way or space. Now, I didn't include an example of how to do a yard increase on this particular portion of the slide, but I did include one here for a unlimited area building. So what we see in red, that is basically our lot. What you see here in gray, this is my building. And I'm going to say the building is 380 feet by 300. So it's 114,000 square foot. We're calling it a type 2A building with a group M and it's sprinkled. So that meets all the criteria of section 507.4, except you'll notice I don't have 30-foot yards minimum on all sides. I've got one side where, or excuse me, I don't have 60-foot yards on all sides. I've got 50 on one side, I've got 21 on another, while the other two sides do meet the 60-foot. So I don't meet all the criteria of 507.4. So the question then becomes, can I get a increase on this building for area? So what we have to do again is we're going to look at, in this case, for an unlimited area building, we're going to look at the sides of the building that have at least 30 feet. So that's going to be across the top here. I've got at least 30 foot of fire separation distance. On the left side, I've got 60. On the bottom, I've got 50. So I've got 380 feet plus 300 feet plus 380 feet. And that is the perimeter of the building that has at least 30-foot yards. Then I'm going to take the total perimeter of the building, add that up. So what I've done down at the bottom here is done that math. So 380 plus 380 plus 300 is 1,060. All sides of the building together is 1,360. I divide the sides of the building with the perimeter of at least 60-foot frontage by the total perimeter. I get 0.779 or 78%. My smallest yard that's over 30 feet is 50. So that smallest yard is going to regulate the increase. So let's go back to the previous slide. So we said we had 78% of the building. So percentage of building perimeter, 78% falls under the bottom here. My smallest yard that was over 30 was 50. I believe we said, wasn't it? So we're going to come over here to 50 to less than 55. I get a 1.38%, 138% increase in the allowable area of the building. This is the same way we use the other table, but this table only applies to when we have 30 feet or more, and it's for unlimited area buildings.
Oh, Bill, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, so has there been any discussion of moving A3, specifically bowling, due to the change in construction method of bowling into the unlimited area category?
There's already provisions in 507 that allow A occupancies in unlimited area buildings. So I don't know why we would need to do anything specific for A3.
That's the only question right now.
Okay, very good. So when we use this table, basically we have to go through an analysis. So we're looking at the allowable tabular area for the building as I described here is 86,000 square feet, but we have 114,000. So the building's too big, and I'm trying to find a way to get a area increase on it. So we're looking at doing a yard increase. Well, we just went through that exercise, and now I get to be 97,200 square feet. Still not big enough. If we're just doing a basic yard increase. But with a basic yard increase, the maximum increase I can ever get on a building is 75% of the allowable area for a non-sprinkled building. When I use this table, and it only applies to these unlimited area buildings, I look at, can it be an unlimited area building? Well, no, because I don't have 60-foot yards on all sides. Doesn't meet the requirements in 507.4. It meets the 1-story, it meets the occupancy group, it meets the type of construction because it's type 1 or 2. But again, it doesn't meet the 60-foot yard. So I can't just call it an unlimited area building. So then we use the table 507331. We determined that we got a 1.38 increase. So doing that, I take my base allowable area for the type 2A group M sprinkled single story. My base allowable area is 86,000 square feet out of table 506.2. My increase with 1.38 per the 21.5, that's my base allowable area for a non-sprinkled building. Add those two together, and I get 115,670 square feet allowable area. My building's 114,000, so this works. So using this method for an unlimited area building that does not have 60-foot yards on all sides, I was able to make this building work without having to jump up to a type 1 construction where we get into just pure unlimited. So it's a tool that's available to you that was in the 21 code as well as the 24, but in the 24 code, they added this language in blue just to clarify that you have to use the smallest open space that's over 30 feet to make that station, and that's going to be my 50 feet right here. The 21 feet is less than 30, that's why we don't get to use that at all. Hopefully that makes sense to you. It's actually quite easy once you do it a couple times. And what I would suggest to you is just make up an example like what you see here and run through the exercise, see if you get it right. And I'll make this offer to you. If you make up something like this and you're not sure if you got it right, email it to me. It'll only take me a minute to look at it and I can tell you whether or not it worked. All right, live work units. This used to be in section 419 of the code. Live work units moved to section 505.5. And the only reason they moved it is because live work units have criteria for the limitation of allowable area. No individual live work unit can be more than 3,000 square feet. The work portion can be no more than 50% of the total building area. So they moved it all into chapter 5 because that's where we have all of our limitations of height and area. And what they've done now is they said for a live work unit located in a building constructed in accordance with this code, meaning the IBC out of 508.5, both the residential and non-residential portion have to comply with 508.5 through 508.511. Then they added for a live work unit located in a building constructed in accordance with the IRC, the non-residential portion of the live work unit shall comply with 508.5.1 through 508.5.11. And the residential portion of the live work unit has to be constructed in accordance with the IRC and IBC section 508.5.7, which requires sprinklers and smoke alarms. Now, if you build this out of the IBC per that first bullet, number 1, then it's going to tell you that you need to have a fire sprinkler in accordance with NFPA 13 or 13R. But if you're building it using the IRC for the residential portion down here per the second bullet, it then also allows the use of a 2904, a P2904, or a 13D sprinkler for the residential portion. However, the commercial portion would still have to be sprinkled with a NFPA 13. And remember, to be a live work unit, the entire unit, so the work portion and the live portion, all needs to be sprinkled. Live work units and buildings constructed in accordance with the code have to provide an automatic sprinkler. And this is where it tells you in accordance with a NFPA 13 or a 13R. Has to have smoke alarms. This is the same thing that you're going to have in your home. And where you need, if the code requires a 907, a manual fire alarm, then you also have to install those. So you then go back to 907-292 to determine if a fire alarm is required. This is different from a smoke alarm. Any building constructed in accordance with the International Residential Code shall be provided with sprinkler system and smoke alarms. And again, like I say, this is your standard smoke alarm like you see in your typical home.
Okay, I have another question.
Yes.
Okay, do live work unit requirements apply to fire station dormitories? If so, does this evaluate the entire facility for occupancy ratios, or is this within a dorm unit?
Neither one. Live work units are specific as defined in 508.5, and there's specific limitations to how much of it can be commercial, how much can be living, the overall size, and the whole thing with a live work unit. When you look at these in the photo here, you've got a business down below and a residence up above. It's non-separated use, and so the intent is that this office space below or whatever the business is belongs to the people living above. It's not to be separated into separated uses or rented out to somebody as office space and I live above you. That's not the intent of a live work. Fire stations are generally classified the living space as R2 or R3. The garage space where the fire apparatus is kept is classified as S2. And then the common gathering space is generally classified as being either A3, or if it's less than 750 square feet, it's just going to be part of the R2 or the R3. And remember, the definition in chapter 3 for R2 or R3 now includes those emergency responder, those fire department living spaces. However, it's separated by congregate living of more than or less than 16 persons.
Okay, also, does the commercial part of the live work need to be on the ground floor, or is the code silent on that?
It's going to have to be on the ground floor because it's going to have to be accessible. So otherwise, you're going to have to put an elevator in to make it accessible.
And then one more, is there any movement towards accepting non-combustible construction in lieu of automatic fire sprinklers?
No. No, when you consider that non-combustible construction, you know, is typically used in a type 1 or 2 building, and non-combustible construction helps compartmentalize, but it does not knock down a fire. And when we look at any kind of the provisions in chapter 7, chapter 6 and 7 of the code, we're looking at a combination of three things. We look at first the type of construction being combustible or non-combustible relates to our ability to compartmentalize fires. When we go into chapter 7, we have rated exterior walls, firewalls, fire barriers, fire partitions, smoke barriers. Each of those provides a different level of compartmentalization as well as horizontal assemblies, whether they're combustible or non-combustible. But none of those do anything to control a fire. They help contain a fire, but they don't control a fire. Sprinklers, on the other hand, a 13R is designed not to save the building, but to give the occupants time to get out because it knocks down the fire, thus knocking down the smoke, and maintains a tenable atmosphere. Whereas a 13 sprinkler system knocks down the fire to a degree and it responds slower than a quick response 13R system, but it's there to save the building and make the exit passageways tenable. But by going to non-combustible versus sprinkler, you lose that containment of fire. You may still have compartmentalization, but you don't have the ability anymore to knock down a fire.
And then there's one clarification on that last question about the commercial part of live work being on the ground floor. If there is an elevator already in the building, does the live work have to be, can the commercial part be on another floor than the ground floor?
Well, I'll tell you what, let's explore that for just a second here. I pulled the code book up on my screen. Hopefully you can see that. And let's go to chapter 5. And we'll go to 508 and 508.5 for live work units. And basically limitations. And so looking through limitations, it says live work units permitted to be not greater than 3,000 square feet. Residential area permitted to be not more than 50%. Non-residential areas shall be limited to the first or main floor only. So it does specifically say that.
Okay, and those are the only questions we have right now.
All right. We get back to our presentation here. Questions, guys? This is table 509. 509 was previously known or labeled as incidental accessory uses. That was back in the 2018 and older code. And in 2018, I think it was actually the 15 and older. In 18, they took the word accessory off of it, and it strictly says incidental uses. The reason for that is that anything that falls under this table is considered to be a higher risk or a higher hazard. And so we don't want to imply that it can be treated as accessory, which requires no separation, or imply that it can be treated as non-separated or separated uses, because this is something that has a higher degree of hazard associated with it. So when you look at the column on the left, you'll see a number of specific items that are considered to be more hazardous. And then on the column on the right, it tells you what the separation and or protection must be. The ones I've highlighted in yellow are ones that have changed for the 2024 code. So some of those used to say 1 hour or provide an automatic sprinkler. And now it says 1 hour and provide the sprinkler. So if it says 1 hour and, you're going to be building a fire barrier in accordance with section 707 and horizontal assemblies in accordance with section 711 and providing the NFPA 13 fire sprinkler that's required for the space. If it gives you the choice, like up here at the group E, 1 hour or provide the sprinkler, then you can build the fire barrier or provide the sprinkler. You have a choice. However, if you use the sprinkler, you're not totally off the hook. The wall that's being built to surround the incidental use must be constructed to resist the passage of smoke and gases. The door has to be self-closing, self-latching, can't be undercut more than 3/4 of an inch per NFPA 80. And if you have any kind of a penetration through the wall, that penetration must be treated in accordance with section 714. And if there's ductwork penetrating it, it's going to need a smoke damper in there. So you're not just totally off the hook there. But these are the things that changed, and you'll see a couple of minor changes in the left column as well. Now, in allowable materials in chapter 6 is where we talk about type 1, type 2, etc. construction. And in 603, there's been a list of 28 items where you can use combustible materials in a type 1 or 2 building, which the base requirements for type 1 or 2 is it's a non-combustible building. But in the 24 code, they added item 28, vapor retarders are allowed as an allowable material in a type 1 or 2 construction. And it's simply because other sections of the code back in chapter 14 require the vapor retarder. Therefore, if you build a type 1 or 2 building, you're going to have to put that combustible material on there. And it's for the good of protecting the building. And so they've recognized they needed to tie those two sections of the code together. Your protection of primary structural frame all comes under table 601 in the code. And table 601 is the building element table that tells you, based on the type of construction, what the rating of the primary structural frame, secondary structural frame, etc. Has to be. And then you have to go to section 704 and look at the various sections there, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, etc., to determine how you protect the primary or the secondary structural frame. The intent has always been that the primary structural frame is protected individually, not just within a wall assembly. So where a column extends through a ceiling, the encasement protection shall be continuous from the top of the foundation or floor ceiling assembly through the ceiling space to the top of the column. So it's going to be continuous all the way through. Then there were some exceptions, and the exception 2 and 3 were added. And it says primary structural members other than columns, so we're talking about beams or diagonal members that are there for the support of columns under gravity load. So primary structural members other than columns that do not support more than 2 floors or 1 floor and a roof or a load-bearing wall or a non-load-bearing wall more than 2 stories high are permitted to be protected by the membrane of a fire resistance rated wall or horizontal assembly where the membrane provides the required fire resistance rating. So this gives you some conditions in which that horizontal beam or that diagonal member may not be required to be individually protected. But if you're counting on the wall that it's located within or the horizontal assembly that it's located in, that horizontal wall assembly may only be required to be 1 hour, but the primary structural frame might need a 2-hour protection. So if you're going to use this exception number 2, that wall or horizontal assembly is going to have to meet that higher rating requirement. And then the item 3 is columns that meet the limitation of section 704.3.1. That is light frame construction boundary elements. That's what that exception refers to.
Okay, I've got 2 questions on this.
Yep.
Okay, so please comment on usage of exposed mass timber / cross-laminated wood in high-rise construction as primary structural frame.
Okay, so mass timber or heavy timber construction known as type 4 up until the 21 code couldn't be used in a high-rise building because the building's too tall for the type of construction. Now in the 21 code, we recognize and have created type 4 heavy timber, type 4A, 4B, and 4C. And when you look at table 601, those 4 categories of heavy timber now have anywhere from a 1 to a 3-hour rating for primary structural frame, depending upon what the use of the building is and what members we're talking about. When it starts talking about heavy timber type 4A, that's effectively equivalent to a 2A building. And you could build that as a high-rise building, but the only place in the code you can go is back to 2304.11. And in 2304.11, it gives you the minimum sizes for the structural members. And then because it's a 4A building, you then go to section 722 and table 722.7. And in there, it's going to tell you what additional membranes have to be installed over the heavy timber and the connections of the heavy timber for it to achieve that 2 or 3-hour rating. Because remember, heavy timber by itself has a char rating of effectively 1 hour. And that's why it's always been considered to be equivalent to 1-hour construction. But when you need to go per table 601 to those higher ratings, you're going to have to fall back to 2304.11 and 722.7 to determine how you can do it.
And one more question. This is, we have seen clients requesting wood treads in type 2 buildings. Can heavy timber treads be used in a type 2 building?
So basically, you're going to again have to look at what is the allowable materials in a type 1 and 2 building. And the allowable materials in a type 1 and 2 building is not possible. So even though heavy timber is equivalent to 1 hour, it's still combustible. So no, you can't use that except for in section 510.2 of the code for podium buildings, there's a new exception in there that if you build a 3-hour shaft, you can use wood for your stairs within the 3-hour shaft.
And that's all right now.
Okay, good question. So your protection of secondary structural members is in 704.3, and it says secondary structural members required to have protection to achieve a fire rating shall be protected by individual encasement protection. Then they added the new language, or by the membrane of a fire resistance rated wall or horizontal assembly where the membrane provides the required fire rating. So basically the same thing we said in 704.2, but you're going to have to pay attention to the requirements in table 601 and make sure that the rating requirements of that member are being met by the horizontal or vertical assembly. Continuity requirements for exterior walls has always been a challenge. Many times people build them like what you see here. This is representing a type 3 building. And remember, in type 3 buildings, the exterior wall is supposed to be of non-combustible construction. Excuse me. However, in the 21 code, we allowed FRT to be used in the exterior wall in lieu of non-combustible, as long as that exterior wall had a required rating of no more than 2 hours. Now, FRT is combustible. The difference is it won't sustain fire. So if I take a piece of FRT and I hold a plumber's torch against it, a butane torch, and I hold that torch against it, it'll char, it'll ember. Pull the torch away, it stops burning. Put the torch back, it starts burning. So while it won't support fire, it is combustible. It will burn given exposure to fire long enough. So basically in 705.6, we've added some new language about the continuity requirements for the exterior walls. And this diagram you see here was put out by the American Wood Council. And this is an example of a detail for a type 3A wall floor intersection. And what they're trying to take care of is this breach that occurs right here. So I have a 2-hour exterior wall, but I have a 1-hour floor ceiling assembly interrupting it. Well, that creates a breach right there in my wall assembly. And once I've got that breach in the wall assembly, I'm no longer meeting the criteria of 705.6. So this new language has been added to allow this type of a condition. Your floor assemblies, like we said, type 3 construction where a floor assembly supports gravity loads from an exterior wall, so it's bearing, in other words. The fire resistance rating of the portion of the floor assembly that supports the exterior wall shall be not less than the fire rating required in table 601. So if we have a horizontal assembly supporting the wall, it's still going to have to meet the requirements in 601. The fire rating provided by the portion of the floor assembly supporting within the plane of the exterior wall shall be permitted to include the contribution of the ceiling membrane when considering exposure. So if I'm looking at exposure from the outside of this wall, and we're looking at it burning through, I get to consider what does this membrane contribute to the fire rating. If you go back into section 722 of the code, there are several tables there under the calculated fire resistance. And those tables, one of them, actually two different tables in there, includes a calculated fire resistive rating for the membrane, as you see here. And based on, is it 5/8 inch X, is it type C, half inch X, it'll tell you what the calculated time rating is for that. When we get into openings in fire barriers, this has long been something that's been ignored and really shouldn't be. So a fire barrier, just like a firewall, has a limitation of aggregate openings in any width of wall, no more than 25% of the length of the wall, and no single opening greater than 156 square feet. Well, where this became a problem is, as you see in the picture here, if this is a singular elevator shaft, and that shaft has to be constructed as a fire barrier. I put 3 doors in it. Is that more than 25% of that length of wall? Absolutely, it is. So they put an exception into the code for openings providing entrance to an elevator car. And the reason they put that exception is you have in elevators, you have the hoistway doors, which is effectively a double door, which has a rating to it by itself. And then we also have the smoke door that goes over the outside of it, or we have the smoke curtain, which is an alternate method, but it's another way to protect the hoistway. So they added the exception number 6 to allow this condition for elevators. Now, the other conditions that they added is openings shall not be limited to an aggregate width of 25% of the length of the wall where the opening serves a shaft enclosure in accordance with 713. Remember, 713 is a section of the code that you go to determine if a shaft is necessary. You start in 712. When you determine a shaft is necessary, 713 will tell you how it has to be constructed and what the limitations are. Again, shafts are constructed as fire barriers, so that 25% of the length of the wall restriction applies. But now there's an exception number 7 for openings serving a shaft enclosure in accordance with 713, and also openings not limited to 25% of the aggregate width where it serves a chute access or a chute discharge room. Basically, that's because once we get into the chute, there's going to be fire sprinklers in there as well. When we get to the discharge room, the room is also going to be protected with fire resistive rating equivalent to that of the shaft. Fire partitions are the next step down in the hierarchy of fire rated walls. Fire partitions are used to enclose elevator lobbies, and where they're used for that purpose in accordance with 3006, they shall form an enclosure that terminates at a fire barrier or a fire partition having a fire resistance rating of not less than 1 hour or an outside wall. Now, I find it humorous that they use the term outside wall. Nowhere else in the code is an exterior wall referred to as anything but an exterior wall. I guarantee that one word will go through a code change within the next 2 code cycles. Continuity requirements of smoke partitions shall extend from the top of the foundation or floor to the underside of the deck or slab above. And remember, a smoke partition is typically used in I2 construction. And what we're trying to achieve with smoke partitions is not fire resistance rating, because there is no fire rating to a smoke partition. There is a fire rating to a smoke barrier, but not a fire partition. Smoke partitions are only there for restricting the transfer of smoke and gases. So the new exception here as to where it says this had to be tight to the underside of the roof above or the floor above, says in group I2, a lay-in ceiling system shall be considered capable of limiting the transferring of the smoke where the ceiling tiles weigh not less than 1 pound per square foot and where the HVAC system is fully ducted. So by doing those 2 things, you're going to help prevent the transfer of smoke. Now, the weight of not less than 1 pound per square foot of tile is important. When you get into a fire situation within a building, fire will create its own winds, and that's where we get the door closing and door latching for smoke rated doors. The same thing with the ceiling at 1 pound per square foot. That's heavy enough that the wind that's created by the fire will prevent the tile from just blowing up and out and then the smoke being able to transfer. Smoke partition walls enclosing elevator lobbies in accordance with 3006.3 shall form an enclosure that terminates at a fire barrier having a fire resistance rating of not less than 1 hour, another smoke partition, or an exterior wall. So it's telling you where you need to terminate these. By the way, in case you weren't aware, all of the elevator requirements that have been spread throughout the code are now contained in Chapter 30 as of the 2021 code. So you have one place to go. The only thing that's not in Chapter 30 is the fire barrier requirements, how you construct it, and the shaft requirements. Those are in 707 and 713 respectively. If you get into section 714, this is where we talk about penetrations, and sleeves are one of the things that have been used for penetrations for generations of the code, but they typically are being installed improperly. And it says where sleeves are used, they shall be securely fastened to the assembly penetrated and installed in accordance with the manufacturer's instructions. Where the sleeve system, the listed system is used, the sleeve shall be installed in accordance with the listing criteria. So anytime we do a listing for a sleeve or fire penetration system, there's criteria on how it can be used, where it can be used, what the penetrating items can be, how many penetrating items. In this case, you see 4 low voltage wires or cables. And then it talks about how it has to be installed. The manufacturer's installation instructions are based on the test criteria that it went through to achieve its listing. And so it's critical that they be installed per that. And one of the biggest mistakes in this industry we make is we see red fire caulking, we think the world is good. Well, fire caulking by itself has 0 rating. None whatsoever. I don't care what it says on the tube. It's part of a system. And the listing criteria for the system and the installation instructions is how you determine how it has to be installed. Horizontal assembly and through penetrations in 714. Let's just tell you that 714.5 went through many changes, too many to cover here today. But there's a lot of changes. However, they did acknowledge the fact that penetrations of concrete floors or ramps within parking garages, and there's parking above and below the penetrations, and those are parking areas. We don't need to worry about those penetrations because look at the photo here. What good does it do me to protect a penetration in the floor over here if I have this giant opening so I can drive a car up and down? So they finally have recognized that and put that into the code. Through penetration fire stops again are in 714.5. The new exception, penetrations in a single concrete floor by steel ferrous copper conduits with a maximum 6-inch nominal diameter do not require a T rating. The penetrating items shall not be limited to the penetration of a single floor, provided the area of the opening through the floor does not exceed 144 square inches. The listed joint systems, which is what you see here, this is where you have a floor system coming up against a wall, or we also see these in conditions where we have a wall coming up to a roof or a floor ceiling system. That is also a joint system. Listed fire resistive joint systems, perimeter fire containment systems. This is a perimeter system you see in the picture. Shall be securely installed in accordance with the manufacturer's installation instructions and the listing criteria in or on the joint or void for its entire length, so as not to dislodge, loosen, or otherwise impair its ability to accommodate expected building movement and to resist the passage of fire and gases. Remember, smoke and gases kills people. Fire kills buildings. All the big fires we've had over the last several years, the MGM Grand, things like that, were because of either lacking or improperly installed joint systems. And the fire that starts on the lower floor, the smoke and gases wraps its way up and around where this intersection occurs, and the smoke and gases works floor to floor, and that's what kills people. Your approved materials protecting voids have to be securely installed in accordance with the manufacturer's installation in or on the void fire length so as not to dislodge, lose, and impair. What you need to be aware of is that we do a lot of structural design on buildings for seismic conditions, for wind conditions, lateral movement. But when you're doing your joint systems, they have to be designed for that expected movement. So anytime you as the architect are speccing the joint systems, you're speccing the um, penetration systems, those type of things, you need to understand, is it expecting 2 to 3 inches of building movement, or is it expecting less than an inch of building movement? You need to talk to the structural engineer to determine what kind of dynamic movement is expected and make sure that the listed system that you're selecting meets that. That's a whole 1-day class by itself, so we don't have time to cover it today. Anytime you have a curtain wall or fire resistance rated floor intersection, that's where you're going to get into a system such as you see in the picture here. And that system is also known as a perimeter fire containment system. And those fire containment systems have to be installed anytime you have that intersection of those walls and floors. However, the exceptions are floors within a single dwelling unit, floors and ramps within parking garages because it's open anyway, and mezzanine floors because a mezzanine floor is not a story. A mezzanine's just an open area. And again, it's open to the area below anyway, so why are we worried about the joint? This is an example which you see in the picture here of a fire barrier that's butting up against a non-fire resistance rated roof assembly. Not uncommon to have this type of condition. When you have that, the void created at the intersection of a fire barrier and the underside of a non-fire rated roof, sheathing slab or deck above, shall be filled by an approved material or system to retard the passage of fire and gases, or protected by an approved continuity head of wall system. A head of wall system is what you see in the drawing here. It has to have an ASTM rating in accordance with E2837 to provide an F rating and a T rating for a time period of not less than that required for the fire barrier. Remember, fire barriers can be anywhere from 1/2 hour to 3 hour rating. So you have to make sure that the joint system that you're using at this intersection has an equal rating. And again, when we select a joint system, we have to look at the load that's posed. We also have to look is it for static, in other words, no movement expected, or dynamic? And remember, winds can cause dynamic movement. A wind blowing across a flat roof can actually cause the roof to move like water or move like a wave. And that can cause anywhere from 1 to 5 inches of movement. So we just talked about F and T rating. What is it? Well, fortunately for you, it's a defined term in 202. So an F rating is the time period that the through penetration fire stop system, perimeter fire containment system, or the continuity head of wall system limits the spread of fire through the penetration or the void. T rating is the time period that the penetration fire stop system, including the penetrating item, or the continuity head of wall system limits the maximum temperature rise to 325 degrees above its initial temperature through the penetration or void on the non-fire side. When they test an assembly and they're testing a joint system or they're testing a penetration, they expose one side to fire and they measure the temperature rise on the other side. And this T rating, that's where that comes in. And if it rises more than 325 degrees, then it's got to have a T rating, which limits the rise. L rating is typically a leakage rating. It's tested at a ambient air temperature and at an elevated temperature of 400 degrees. The L rating is something that's typically found for penetrations of smoke barriers and smoke partitions. There's also something called a W rating. We're not really covering it here because there's nothing in the code that requires a W rating. That's a water leakage rating. Sometimes you as designers may specify an assembly with a W rating, but from the code side, there's nothing that would ever require that. Under section 718 of the code, we've added some new materials that can be used for fire blocking. Now you can use 1 thickness of 1932 fire retardant treated wood, otherwise known as FRT, complying with section 2303. Now remember that fire retardant treated wood is any wood product when impregnated with chemicals by a pressure process or other means during manufacture. It's then tested to an ASTM or UL standard, and it has to be continued for an additional 20-minute period, and the flame can't progress more than 10.5 feet beyond the center line of the burners. So that's the criteria used to determine FRT. There are no products, and I want to emphasize this, no approved that you can paint on a piece of wood and call it FRT. Notice that it says it has to be impregnated into the wood or pressure process and done during manufacturing. So unlike pressure treated lumber, which has protection on it for rot, FRT, there are no paint products. I don't care what it says on the can. None of them have been approved by either UL testing or ASTM E84 testing. Automatic sprinkler systems are regulated under section 903. Now, if we have a lab involving testing, research, and development of lithium ion or lithium metal batteries, you're going to have to put a fire sprinkler in it. Now, typically remember we said earlier, this would be considered a group B occupancy. In 903, there are really no triggers to sprinkle a group B occupancy other than now this, or if you have a group B occupancy that fits under a certain criteria for outpatient services or some medical procedures that would still be classified as group B, then those would require a sprinkler. But this is the new one. And it's again, I said that we have a lot of new considerations in the code based on the lithium ion batteries. Under group F1,
Bill, I got
yes,
a couple
yes.
questions. Okay, how do you treat the cut end of a fire rated piece of lumber to maintain the rating?
So under the cut end for an FRT piece of lumber, you're basically going to have to get the instructions from the manufacturer. And some of those manufacturers will have limitations as to the length of the cut or the size of the cut, and it'll tell you whether or not it has to be treated. In that case, they oftentimes, and contrary to what we just said, do have chemicals that you can apply to it in the field, but you can't use that chemical on an entire 2x4 and call it now FRT.
Okay, the next question. Does fire sprinkling actually do anything for a chemical fire, such as batteries?
Absolutely. One of the things sprinklers does is it helps knock down the fire, which knocks down the smoke. And remember that smoke kills people, and the intent of the fire sprinklers is to get people out of the building. So yes, it absolutely does do something. Now we have to be aware of when we get into H occupancies, those are required to be fire sprinkled, but there are some chemicals that the chemical is water reactive, and therefore adding water to the mix is very bad. It can even be explosive. In those cases, you have fire suppression systems, not fire sprinkler systems. And then it's a chemical foam or some type of a fire suppression that does not involve water.
And then there was a question here, I'm not sure, it says, is there a minimum square footage to this consideration? I think that was just before you started answering questions.
I presume the question is about the laboratory and when it needs to be fire sprinkled for lithium ion batteries. And if that's the case, no. If it falls under group E and it's doing lithium ion or lithium metal battery testing, then you have to fire sprinkle it. No limitation on area.
Yep, that actually was clarified. So yes, you've answered the question. And that's all we have right
Okay,
now. Thank you.
very good. Now, the same type of thing applies to group F1 now. Remember, we said that the fabrication, manufacturing of batteries will fall, lithium ion batteries will fall under group F1. And it said an automatic sprinkler system shall be provided throughout all buildings containing a group F1 where one of the following condition exists. F1 occupancy is used to manufacture lithium ion or lithium metal batteries, or group 1 F1 occupancy is used to manufacture vehicles, energy storage systems, otherwise known as ESS systems, or equipment containing lithium ion or lithium metal batteries where the batteries are installed as part of the manufacturing process. Now, the picture shows vehicles, but there's lots of other uses where lithium ion is installed as part of the manufacturing processes. Some flashlights where the battery is actually built into it. It's a rechargeable battery. It's not one that's replaced. Computers, cell phones, all sorts of things where this could be a consideration. The picture you see here is, I don't know if you guys remember, just recently, Houston had a fire where the Amazon electric vehicles were being manufactured. And fortunately, they were in the outdoor parking lot, but one of them just combusted all on its own. And by the time they recognized it and got the fire put out, it had taken out a number of vehicles. Now, one of the things that they do in these facilities, look at the spacing between vehicles. It's not like a normal parking lot, and they provide spacing between them to help keep that lithium ion fire from spreading.
Okay, Bill.
Automatic sprinklers.
Oh, sorry,
Yes.
Bill. So can you elaborate on the code requirement for battery storage systems in relation to PIV as required by Cal Green?
As required by which?
Cal Green? Like, it's all
I'm
one.
not from,
Okay, you don't know?
yeah, I'm not familiar with the California code whatsoever.
Thanks. That was the only question. Thanks.
Okay. So an automatic sprinkler system has to be provided in a room or space within a group M, where required for the storage of lithium ion or lithium metal batteries, in accordance with section 320 of the IFC or chapter 32. There's lots of new requirements in the IBC and the IFC specifically related to lithium ion batteries. I mean, there's sections of the code have been written. It's become such an issue. 13R sprinklers is what we typically see used in apartment buildings, hotels that don't have any kind of mixed use, that type of thing. But one of the problems we've run into is that the 13R is a quick response head. It's got limitations as to what portions of the building you have to put it in. For instance, smaller bathrooms, less than 300 square feet, typically don't get the sprinkler in them. Closets, less than 80 square feet, don't get the sprinkler in them. Whereas a full 13, everything gets sprinkled. The other thing with the 13R is concealed spaces, such as in combustible floors or combustible attics, are not required to be sprinkled. They're still going to have draft stopping or sprinklers. But what they've done is, because of that, they've added some criteria to the code in the last two code cycles. And it says now that you, in the 21 code, says you can't use a 13R for a building greater than 4 stories above grade plane. Now, where this is critical is that in section 510.2 of the code, we have podium buildings. And remember, up till the 21 code, when you look at a podium building, you count the number of stories below the 3-hour horizontal separation as one building, and then the number of stories above it as a separate building. So I could actually end up with 4 stories of wood frame construction on top of a 3-hour podium, but it's realistically 6 stories in the air as long as it met the height in feet from grade plane. Well, they've recognized that created a problem for the firefighters and the equipment to be able to access and fight the fire. So now the limitation for a 13R sprinkler is 4 stories or fewer above grade plane. And again, doesn't matter if that's a podium building or not. And then for other than group R2, the floor level of the highest story is 30 feet or less above the lowest level of fire department access. So that's going to be for an R1 building. And you can use a 13R in an R1 or in an R2. That's why they put a separate criteria there. For a group R2 occupancy, the roof assembly is less than 45 feet above the lowest level of fire department vehicle access. So now we're also measuring to the roof assembly, but then it tells you how to measure the roof. It says the height of the roof assembly shall be determined by measuring the distance from the lowest required vehicle access road surface adjacent to the building to the eave of the highest pitched roof and the intersection of the highest roof to the exterior wall or the top of the highest parapet. So we're going to go all the way from the vehicle access to the eave of the highest pitched roof or the intersection of the highest roof to the exterior wall. This is different than the definition in Chapter 2 for building height. This is specific to when you are trying to use a 13R sprinkler system. Section 915 of the code, we've got some new requirements regarding carbon monoxide detectors, multiple changes affecting when and where you use them in group R and E, and private garages of group U. Doesn't change anything for group S. Carbon monoxide alarms, again, have to receive all their power from commercial sources. We used to say it could be from commercial battery, but now it's only from a commercial source. And if the primary power is interrupted, it needs to have a battery backup. We also, in Chapter 10, which is a section where we get into means of egress, Table 1004.5 has all the different criteria for function of use as to what the occupant load factor is that you use to determine occupant load for buildings. We've added a category for information technology equipment facilities, and that's going to be 300 gross square foot. And then they do provide a definition for what a information technology is or a data center. Be careful with this though, when it says 300 gross, or if it says 300 net in the code, what we do all the time, and we see building officials as well as design professionals do this, and I'm going to implore you, do not do this, is that we play games with the 300 gross or the 300 net or 100, whatever it might be. And what I mean by we play games with it is we take a business space and we say, well, I've got all this desk space over here and I'm going to include that, but then I've got these circulation paths, so I'm going to take all that out. Nothing in the code allows you to do that. When you go back to definitions in 202, it tells you what the definition of floor area gross is and floor area net. And it tells you what you can take out. You don't get to take out the bathrooms in gross. You don't get to take out circulation paths. You don't get to take out closets. When they came up with the numbers that are in table 1004.5, all that was already taken into consideration. So don't double dip and start taking out these areas. It's not allowed in the code, and you should not be doing it as part of your design. Remember, I told you earlier in our presentation today that the term occupiable roofs is now built into several areas of Chapter 10. So when you look at this table, the head of the table says stories and occupiable roofs with one exit or access to one exit. So again, when we look at the area that's circled down at the bottom in red, says the table is for occupiable roofs accessed through and serving individual dwelling units in group R2. For R2 occupancies with occupiable roofs that are not accessed through and serving individual units, use the other table. So you've got this one that's for R2, but it has to meet the criteria in the footnotes. If it doesn't meet that criteria, then you go to the table which is paren 2 and you apply your factors there to determine whether or not you have to have more than one exit from the individual stories. So this one, as you can see, basement, first, second, or third story above grade plane and occupiable roofs over the first or second story above grade plane. And again, that goes back to the theory I told you before that an occupiable roof is effectively a story for purposes of exiting. So they're treating that occupiable roof above the second story as a third story for this purpose.
Bill, I just have a quick question. And this may be because you're hitting only highlights because we just have 2 hours. Are there any updates in section 909?
I don't have any updates in the presentation. There were none that felt quite as critical. There are some changes, but we didn't include them in the presentation
Okay,
today.
that's what I figured. Thank you. Okay.
You bet. On this table 100634 paren 2, this is for everything other than an R2 or an R2 that didn't meet the footnotes in table paren 1. And again, here it says first story above or below grade plane and occupiable roofs over the first story. So again, they're considering the occupiable roof as being a second story. Now here, if you have that occupiable roof and it's even if it's serving an R2, that occupiable roof, if it's not accessed from individual dwelling units and only serving that dwelling unit, and it's more of a general occupied roof for everybody at the R2, then you use this table. We've changed in 1009, which is the accessible means of egress. It says in buildings where required accessible floor is 4 or more stories above or below a level of exit discharge, or where an accessible occupiable roof is above a story that is 3 or more stories above the level of exit discharge, not less than one required means of egress shall be an accessible means of egress, including an elevator, in accordance with 1009.4. So if you get a 5-story building or you have an occupiable roof that's above a story that's 3 stories above the level of exit discharge, so it's above the 5th or 4th floor, then that's going to have an elevator as part of your accessible means of egress. You're also going to have that elevator as part of your accessible route, but this is where it kicks in that you need that elevator for means of egress, which also kicks in the backup power, etc. This one they finally changed in the code. I'm glad they did for 2 reasons. For a long time, the code has required that in group R1 occupancies, not only do you have the exit signs like required anywhere else in a building, but you also have them down near the floor, the low level signs. And these are, have criteria as to where they have to be located. Well, I got to tell you, I travel extensively as a code instructor, and I would have to say that of the hundreds of hotels that I've been in the last 10 years, I've probably seen 2 that comply with the low level signs. And under the existing building code, anytime you're doing an alteration to an R1 or to any other building for that matter, you're going to have to put in the exit signs in compliance with the code for new construction, which meant if you're doing a level 2 alteration in a hotel, you needed to add all these low-level signs. Well, they finally took that out and of the IBC, and it says low-level exit signs are not required in group R1 when the building is equipped throughout with a fire sprinkler in accordance with NFPA 13 or 13R. So we're no longer requiring that because basically all new construction is going to have a fire sprinkler in accordance with one of those two systems. Exit access stairways in 1019, there's been some changes in the code to protection and opening requirements related to occupiable roofs. Just basically telling you how you have to protect the roof area around the stair, but you can still have an exit access stairway from one level of an occupiable roof to another, or from the occupiable roof down one level to get to an exit. Section 1023 deals with interior exit stairways, which are exit enclosures, and they've added language: building construction within 10 feet of the exterior walls of the interior exit stairway or ramp shall comply with 1023.7.1 and 7.2. So this is my stairway, and you'll see in black the walls surrounding it, that's fire barriers. This red wall, that's an exterior wall regulated under section 705.5. But we have additional requirements here in 1023 that talks about the walls that are adjacent to this exterior wall. And what we're trying to do is make sure we don't have a fire that starts over here and gets in through openings or through an unprotected wall, because this wall wasn't required to be protected based on fire separation distance. So you got some new criteria you need to look at there. Exit passageways have always been required to be fire barriers, not fire partitions like a corridor. An exit passageway is an extension of a exit enclosure to an exit discharge. And exit enclosure, you can't have any kind of penetrating items that aren't serving the enclosure except for structural items such as beams or joists. So they built that same exception, new exception number 7, into 1024 for exit passageways. In 1029, we talk about egress courts, and there's a new exception in here for egress courts located at grade that provide direct and unobstructed access to a public way through 2 or more independent paths. The minimum width provided along each path shall be based on the required width or the required capacity, whichever is greater, and shall be maintained along the path. So this is in addition to the requirements that you had up above, and then the exception for the 1 hour construction if you had a court that was less than 10 foot wide. And assembly means of egress, which is section 1030, they've added new language dealing with the common path of travel in assembly areas. And the new language is for a room or space used for assembly purposes having fixed seating shall not, the common path of travel shall not exceed 30 feet from any seat to a point where an occupant has a choice of 2 exits. So in this row of seats, I can't travel more than 30 feet till I get to a point where I have a choice of 2 exits. So here, if I'm in the middle of this row, I'm going to measure out here and then down. When I get here, I can now go that way or the other way. But until I got to the bottom of the stairs, I haven't completed my common path of travel. Chapter 11, accessibility. My God, the changes are numerous. That's going to create a whole new one-day class by itself. Chapter 11, accessibility, still references the ICC A117.1 which used to be known as ANSI A117. ICC took over the development of it a few years back, and so the name has changed. But remember, for designers, you're in the unfortunate position if you have to design to Chapter 11 of the Building Code, 306 of the existing building code, the ICC standard, fair housing, American Barriers Act, ADA, all of that. Building divisions are only charged with looking at Chapter 11 requirements and its reference documents. We will never look at those other documents, with exception of one jurisdiction in the United States that has adopted ADA instead of using Chapter 11. Now, Texas has TAS, which is the Texas Accessibility Code, which is their own accessibility code and effectively looks just like Chapter 11 with a few minor changes and looks just like the ICC standard. However, California accessibility, that's a whole nother beast. And that one requires different certification and all, but it's a completely separate animal. But bear in mind, if you're in a state that's using Chapter 11, lots of accessibility changes in the areas that I've noted on here, including EV charging stations. If you have power operated doors at your public entrances, that's those doors that have a little push button. There's never been anything in the code until now that told you had to have that push button. Basically, it was just if you had the push button, great. Then you went to the standard to determine how it has to be installed, how far away from the door, the heights of the button, etc. Well, now under the code, we have the occupancy groups you see here, group A, B, M, and R1, and with occupant load thresholds that will kick in having those power operated public entrance doors. If you have parking located beneath a building, the accessible spaces also have to be located beneath the building. Now, this has been in the code for generations, but they had to make it even clearer because apparently it was getting missed a lot. And just bear in mind that ANSI, or excuse me, the ICC standard A117 requires 98-inch clear headroom from the entry to the parking facility to the van accessible space and back out again. Lots of changes in Chapter 14 dealing with water resistive barriers, vapor barriers, fenestration flashing, basically all those details we're supposed to get on the plans. Chapter 15, roof assemblies. There's changes for lightning protection as well as raised deck systems. We go into Chapter 22, which is the steel construction of the code. There are new requirements in the code for boltless steel shelving, mostly related to seismic zones. There's also changes in there for steel work platforms, and again, typically related to seismic. If you have Amazon facilities or similar in your jurisdictions, you will be running into these. Wood dimensions in Chapter 23, this is where all the wood criteria comes from. It includes cross-laminated timber. Anytime there's wood dimensions in Chapter 23, it's nominal, except for dimensions of cross-laminated. Those are deemed to be actual. So for a 2x4, we all know that a 2x4 is more like 1.5 inches by 3.5, even 3.25 sometimes. But if it's cross-laminated lumber and it calls for 2x4, it shall be 2 inches by 4 inches. Chapter 29's gone through changes in the last two code cycles regarding your number of fixtures and the separation of fixtures per sexes. We no longer require the separation per sex as of the 21 code. There's options that you can build gender neutral, a little bit deep, more that we can get into in the minutes we have left. But if you're calculating your number of fixtures, the code now says a number of fixtures in a single user toilet facilities single-user bathing facilities or family-assisted units shall be deducted proportionally from the required gender ratios. So when you do the gender ratios in Table 2902, and you come up with needing, say, 4 women and 2 men, if you have a bunch of single user facilities, you can apply those towards it, or even the family or assisted use can be applied towards it, but you can't use it to eliminate the men's. So if you have 2 family or assisted, you can't just say, well, that covers the men. You have to do it proportionally. So you're going to have to apply some to the men and some to the women. I mentioned earlier that all the elevator requirements are now in Chapter 30, and they've added criteria in here about smoke-proof curtain assemblies. Previous to this code, curtain assemblies were not addressed in the code. They were considered an alternate method to the double or the additional door. Well, now the code gives you criteria to be able to use these, and it tells you what testing they have to comply with. That concludes our presentation. If you have any questions, I'm certainly willing to answer them. Please recognize this is copyrighted material. Do not post it online. I find my classes online. I get really upset. Here's my contact information. If you have questions, feel free to email me. I tell you to email me rather than call me because I'm typically teaching and I can't take calls, but I will respond to emails. Thank you for being here today.
I do have one question. This is, do we use building code or plumbing code tables? Which takes precedent?
They're identical, so it doesn't matter. Now, some states, they've replaced the IPC with the UPC, which is significantly different. So you got to be aware of what state you're in. And then generally when they do that, those states will amend the IBC to eliminate Chapter 29.
Okay. Those are all the questions that we have. So that you just go with the more restrictive, I guess, on the what you were just speaking about.
To some degree, but like say if you're in the state of Idaho, they don't use the IPC, they use the UPC, and they've amended Chapter 29 out of the building code. So now you skip that chapter totally and you go to the Uniform Plumbing Code.
Okay, so that those are all the questions we have. So I want to thank Bill for going through all that information today. If there were any chapters that he went over that you would like to see a whole class on next year, because there's a lot of changes, let us know in the post-event, post-session survey. If we get a lot of people asking for a particular section